Residents in Glasgow are in revolt against their SNP council as a safer drugs consumption room has led to increased crime and litter in a family neighbourhood.
While residents of Glasgow gathered last night to call for urgent action to address safety and drug littering following the opening of the UK's first safe consumption room in Glasgow.
Let's go to our Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire, on this one. This is a big dilemma, isn't it? Because these places, oh gosh, they could make such a difference, but yet they're making a difference in the worst possible way.
Yeah, that's correct, Eamon. I mean, just a brief potted history here. Scotland is a world leader in suspected drug deaths. Our little country is, around 1,300 of people are dying from suspected drug deaths every year. The Safe Drug Consumption Facility was to be brought in as a way to try and stem that, part of finding the solution. And indeed, it was something that, the UK government didn't intervene with. It is a UK first. And it was hoped that, it would help a lot of people, and indeed 2,500 people have used the service in the last 3 months, and around 30 serious incidents have happened there, which have obviously had medical supervision and allowed those people to walk out of there again now. But the issue is of this local community is that this is not a treatment centre, and the people here in Calton area of Glasgow, that is what they want, because here in Calton they're surrounded by drug users. Not only that, but because there is a genuine sort of hard and fast rule here that the police cannot stop and search anybody who is using drugs or suspected to be carrying drugs, because they could well be going to that treatment centre, then it's allowed dealers to come in to the local area, and essentially it's open season for them for a lot of vulnerable people. Now, the consumption room is a couple of doors along from a homeless centre, which is a couple of rooms along from a wet room where people can dry out. And as people were saying last night here at St Luke's in Calton, then all of those vulnerable people together in such a close proximity is essentially asking for trouble. One of the biggest revelations, I think, last night that I heard myself was that methadone, which is commonly used to treat opioid addiction, like heroin, which of course I thought was Glasgow's or Scotland's biggest drug problem, but it would appear that I was wrong, and actually cocaine is really the biggest problem that is on the streets of Glasgow just now. But cocaine addiction is not cured by methadone, but we were hearing last night that people are getting prescribed methadone as a kind of one drug cures all. Now, one of those people I spoke to last night was Jamie. Jamie has been a drug user for 15 years. He started off in diazepams and slowly went up through legal highs before ending up on some much harder substances. Honestly, I can't even introduce this guy well enough the way he spoke last night. Here is Jamie talking to me last night here in Calton.
I'm one of the ones that never had a heroin addiction and was on methadone. Do you know what I mean? I'd literally took heroin a few times, do you know what I mean? And I was in a bad place, a bad frame of mind, and their solution was 40 mils of methadone, do you know what I mean? And quite quickly I was up to 100 mils before I knew a year had passed, and I was strung out on the methadone. Do you know what I mean? I was more strung out than any drug I was in my life, do you know what I mean? Can I get some funding for a treatment centre, do you know what I mean? Because I'm going to die out here. Because, to be honest with you, before I came in this meeting, I was just said, I was trying to get myself out of jail a few days ago, do you know what I mean? Because there's no hope out here, do you know what I mean? There's no hope at all, mate, and that's the truth, mate. Do you know what I mean?
So lots of figures flying around last night. The one that caught my eye was 50 million spent on drug rehabilitation, but actually only 1.3 million of that is spent on treatment. Well, residents here in Calton are asking the Scottish Government what is going on, why aren't you listening, and when can we actually start treating our sick and vulnerable people here in Glasgow?
The centre was the UK's first, opened proudly by the First Minister John Swinney.
This is the first of the safer drug consumption facilities to be available in the United Kingdom, and it's here in the city of Glasgow, and it's been a consequence of tenacious work that's been undertaken by various organisations in Glasgow to make sure that we've got every intervention available to us to try to advance on our national mission on drugs. The Safer Drugs Consumption Facility will enable people who were always going to take drugs to be able to do so in a safer, clinical environment, but also to have access to support and advice and counselling to help them to choose a different pathway in life.
And what sort of tangible difference do you hope that a facility like this will make?
I hope it will help us to reduce drugs deaths in Scotland and to help people to find a different route in their life. So we will evaluate the effectiveness of this particular intervention to determine what progress is achieved as a consequence of it, what impact it's had, and to learn the lessons from that.
Glasgow's first safe drug consumption facility. In fact, it's the first anywhere in Scotland and indeed the UK. This is a first-class facility, and we are going to be providing a service which has compassion, dignity at its heart. Obviously, the service itself has been shaped by those with lived and living experience, and they've helped design and shape the building. The FISL will be open from 9 AM to 9 PM, 365 days a year.
But locals say the scheme brought crime and filth.
And I've been speaking to the press and local residents about the horrific situation that local residents are facing because of the new drug consumption facility. Look, I'm all keen to try and make sure that we tackle Scotland's drug death shame. I think it's an absolute scandal, especially my own personal background. But having these unsafe needles and spoons and other paraphernalia lying here in the ground is just not safe. It's only a matter of time before an accident happens, and it's time for the SNP to take urgent action to make sure we clean up this.
One resident found 50 needles during a quick walk of the area. It added to a growing sense of decline in Scotland's largest city, as residents fought an influx of migrants to the point where the majority of local homeless beds were being used by asylum seekers.
This is arguably a situation that's been bubbling away under the surface for a number of years now. Some years ago, the SNP-led Glasgow City Council put itself forward to be a dispersal city to welcome in immigrations, and largely around the world Glasgow is seen as that friendly, welcoming city. But that attitude is now being put to the test when the City Council, as I said, led by the SNP, had to write to Angela Eagle to say that social cohesion is now at risk here in Glasgow because the number of beds that the city has to house its homeless is now 2/3 of them being used by asylum seekers. Now that's about 6,700 beds for homeless people here in Glasgow, and more than 4,000 of them being used to house asylum seekers or applicants. Now, this has really become an issue because here in Scotland, the law is slightly different, that an asylum seeker who states themselves to be homeless is automatically housed, and that, of course, has been building over the years and now seems to be at a crisis point for the city's services. Now, the council here in Glasgow has said that it's really calling on other regions around Scotland to step up and do their part. Certainly, I mean, compared to similar sized cities and settlements around the UK, like Manchester, Glasgow is taking in twice as many as Manchester. And now really here, there's a few major issues that are really bringing people to raise the temperature around this here in Glasgow. It's very much never really spoken about as a problem. Scotland as a whole has never quite had the same problems with illegal immigration, for example, as down in England. But certainly now those tunes have changed. Things like around parks and play parks, there have been a number of instances over the last few weeks where people have caught asylum seekers filming their children, arguably a crossing of wires among cultures, and pensioners, of course, as well. And I spoke to a pensioner earlier on today who spoke about that incredible, difficult balance between what he thinks is right and what the city can handle.
As a person in the community, it's quite distressing because the reality is the government reflects on the money, how it distributes it to causes necessary ones, and this year especially we're in such a huge deficit. Going long term, how long can this go on for? In relation to allowing migrants to come into the country, whether it be legally or illegally, they are still supported. Then we come down to what they call human rights. And where does human rights get weighed up against immigrants as far as daily survival goes for these individuals who are in unfortunate predicaments and rely on the government to support them?
So there you go, this divisive issue that not many people are too keen to talk about, but certainly one that Glasgow City Council says it can meet Angela Eagle anytime, any place to get this sorted.
All right, that's our Scottish reporter Tony Maguire with a fascinating story from Glasgow, and that is a story I think that's been reflected in many of our towns and cities, frankly, the pressure caused by these migrants. Now,